Redistricting Committee hosted a listening tour, and many of you either testified or attended. Thank you. Your input sent a loud message that the community expects fair maps and a transparent process. It is extremely important to provide more specific information about our communities. Your participation tonight is a good sign that you are ready to help. The presenters are Connie Taylor from Johnson County, Mary Galligan, Shawnee County, and Sherry Grogan, Leavenworth County. The League of Women Voters is a national, nonpartisan organization that encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Please help us keep tonight's discussion nonpartisan. Should any partisan comments be made, we will stop the program and/or use the mute button. Our co-host will be monitoring the chat for questions. Thank you again for being actively engaged in the redistricting process. Now, let's pump up your power. Connie, will you continue with the program?
Sure. Thank you, Martha. My name is Connie Taylor, and I'm with the Johnson County League of Women Voters. Thank you again, everyone, for submitting your testimony and for being here tonight. We've seen that every vote matters and every voice matters. We've also heard from some members of the legislative redistricting committees. They're asking for specific information about a community or a district. That's why we encourage you to submit additional testimony that describes your community or district. Tonight, we'll show you how you can incorporate those details in your next round of testimony. And it's important to have this new testimony submitted by December 31st, 2021, before the legislative session begins in January. We'll show you some examples of testimony that incorporates those community details. For now, let's look at examples of community and why they are important. Well, this just gave a hint. So see if you can guess where this picture was taken. If you can see from the picture, it's a cars that are stuck in some kind of traffic problem. There's some, what looks like snow there. So if you could go into the chat and see if you can take a guess at where that could be. Anybody want to guess? So I've heard in the past that some people think that it could be anywhere from Buffalo, New York, Michigan, Chicago, anything on the lake, Lake Michigan, any place that there might be a lake effect. Well, this happened in Watts. And Watts is, yes, it happened in Watts. It's a neighborhood of Los Angeles that has been historically Black and has a large growing Latino population. So what happened was in November 2003, a freak storm dumped more than 5 inches of rain and hail on Watts. It overwhelmed storm drains, flooded the community. So they had about 150 buildings and homes that were heavily damaged. 50,000 people lost power, 6,000 people sought aid from the county's emergency center, and firefighters rescued about 100 people from waist-deep water and snow. Many people lost everything. Household goods, furniture, clothes, cars, appliances. However, the government was slow to aid the people, and FEMA even refused to act when then Governor Gray Davis declared a state of emergency, which was six days after the flood. Well, why is that? So as you can see here, this is a map of Watts. Watts is in green, and it's split into 3 congressional districts. What's even more confusing is that it was split into 3 state Senate districts, and there was one congressional representative was relaying what was happening at the time. Is people in Watts were trying to get assistance. People who lived on the same street could be in a different district. And so even the people in Watts didn't know who their congressional representatives were. And so, you know, they were being ping-ponged back and forth between various congressional representatives. Nobody really knew. So what happened in 2008, California passed the Voters First Act, and it actually created a citizens redistricting commission that would be responsible for drawing district maps. So in 2011, leaders from the Watts community got together and they said, hey, you know, this is our community. This is where it's at. This is who's part of it. And as a result, the commission drew the congressional map that puts Watts in a single congressional district. This is just one example of a community coming together to share their stories that impacts their community. And this is what we call a community of interest. And tonight we're going to talk about a community profile. So now I want to show you some examples locally. So this is an application that we've been using. It's called Districtor. And what happened with this is an area in Manhattan. Some people who work directly with the students at Kansas State University said, you know, let's map where our students are. So that was the focus of this. And they mapped where they identify where people live, where the students live. So both on and off campus, where they had their meals. So their dorms, their dining halls, and then some entertainment places where they had recreation. So we have the stadium, their rec center, the nearest emergency room in case anything happened on campus. And they've identified where these places are. Now they did mention that anything east of Highway 24 here, and you'll see it in part of the notes, you really won't see K-State students there. And even right through here, this is Potawatomi Avenue right down here. Even though all of this is in blue, it's how the block data was from the census. It just pulled that information. But they're saying, no, students, you're not going to find students south of Potawatomi Avenue. And we noticed that, we noted that. The other one that I want to show you is in KCK. And this is the community of El Centro, and El Centro provides assistance to low-income families. And what El Centro did was they said, okay, this is where our clients live. These are the places that we collaborate with. And so you'll see that they've got it pretty much from 635 east to the river, a little bit right through here. And then a little bit, there's a little tuck right here of just south of 35. And they even got this area in Turner. And that's okay. But it noted where their clients lived. It noted who they collaborate with, and what services those collaboration places provide. So they all wanted to be together so that they could serve that community instead of having them being broken up. So these are just a couple examples of communities and how to do your community profile. So now I will turn it over to Mary, who will give you a little bit more information about community profiles and doing your testimony.
Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. This evening we're talking about testimony, and sometimes that can feel a little daunting because it sounds like something really important and official, but really testimony in the legislative world is just a statement. Generally, it's presented to a legislative committee. It can be either oral or written, and those of you who attended the redistricting listening tour saw examples of both. Since many of you presented testimony during the tour, you're past the stage fright bit, but may be stumped a little bit by what the committee chairs have requested in terms of specifics. Don't be put off by that request. The elements of good testimony are really simple. Be clear and be short. Whether you testify in person or in writing, the first thing you do, and you can sort of tick these things off on your fingers, is identify yourself and establish your connection to the issue. In the case of redistricting, it might be that you're a voter in the 54th House District or a resident of Jackson County in the 2nd Congressional District. Then state concisely why you're presenting this information. You may want to let the committee know about important parts of your community that need to be placed together in a representative or senatorial district. Alternatively, or in addition, you may want the committee to know that your county and the surrounding counties should be kept together in the same congressional district. Perhaps the most important supporting information you can provide is why this makes a difference to you. That is your story. It's your community's profile, what Connie just talked to you about. It might be helpful to identify the impact you and your neighbors have experienced by being split into separate districts. For instance, what difficulties have you had by being a rural community that makes up just a small portion of a district dominated by a city? Or what have you experienced by being just a few edge of town precincts in a sprawling rural district? If your community isn't split into separate districts, give an example of how being in a single district has helped you interact with your representatives effectively. And then in that case, maybe your ask is to stay together. Then you bolster your story with facts. So we're up to the fourth point. What did you learn in community conversations about redistricting? Are there numbers that help tell those stories? If your community feels disenfranchised, you might use voter participation statistics to make the point. If your community faces a safety issue, you might point to statistics about fires, EMS calls, crime, and traffic accidents. If your community's housing stock doesn't meet residents' needs, you could point to census data about occupancy, property values, average costs, and other characteristics. The big message here is don't panic about getting together a bunch of numbers. You just need examples, not an encyclopedia. Your conversations with your community will point you to the right data. And remember, the experiences and the impressions of your community are facts also. Say what you want, finally say what you want to have done in very clear terms. In the case of redistricting, a natural is to provide a map, like the ones Connie showed you, that demonstrate the specific area you want to be included in a single district. You don't need to define the district itself, but you should provide an example that shows how your community would fit into a district. Remember that in tonight's context, the thing that holds it all together is the profile of your community. And because one picture is better than 1,000 words, let me share my screen. And get some of my Zoom stuff out of the way. The story, your community profile, what Connie just talked about, and the examples you cite may be the thing that remains in the committee members' memories long after the hearing is complete. You want to give them something they can remember when they sit down to draw a map or to evaluate a map that's presented to them. When preparing and presenting your community profile, use the information you gathered when you and your neighbors identified your community. Who lives there? What kinds of things do they do for a living? What kinds of housing is common? What kinds of city services do you have or do you not have? In this map that's on the slide that was developed during a community workshop here in Topeka, 3 historically cohesive neighborhoods were identified. On some issues, those 3 might work together. On other issues, they might not. The residents decide whether to advocate being put together or separate in House and Senate districts. One of the most daunting things about preparing testimony, and especially when you have a committee chairman leaning across the table saying, give me some specifics, can be finding the objective information that supports the story. Fortunately, access to lots of good information is relatively easy at the Census Bureau's website, data.census.gov. Don't worry about remembering that. We're going to send the links out to you after the meeting. Your city, county, and school district can also be great sources of data to support your story. I have a couple examples here that relate to information from the Census Bureau. In the parts of town identified in the community workshop for the neighborhoods we saw earlier, in the Census Bureau, we find a high concentration of housing that's well below the county average value. A description of where low home values are concentrated may support several stories that come out in a community profile. Residents' low incomes, absence of retail businesses or public amenities, or the need for home maintenance assistance, to name just a few. If transportation also came up as part of the community story during a workshop, you might find supporting data showing that, in fact, many people in the neighborhood don't have access to a vehicle. That can point to the need for increased state support for bus service. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to think about talking to legislators about. So with the story and the facts, you can create a powerful ask. So for instance, we need to be in the same district so we can work effectively with our representative to improve our housing stock and public transportation. This is important because if we're split into multiple districts, each part will be too small to gain the attention of the representatives. That last statement is just exactly the experience of those residents of Watts that Connie talked about in the opening. So we've prepared for you, and I've got another share here, so bear with me a second. A template that will help you sort of stay on point and stay concise so you can make your story real to the legislature. So as I indicated, you want to say who you are, that's in the green part. You want to draw their attention to, for instance, the issue of not splitting a neighborhood in a district. And then the majority of your testimony, and remember this is going to be short testimony, maybe only 2 pages, but the majority of that's going to be your story. along with those facts that you've identified that support the story, and a little bit about what's the what if this isn't remedied, what happens to our community? And then finally, very concisely, we're asking you to do X, Y, or Z. That's the please, then the thank you, and close with all the information that the Legislative Research Department has indicated they want to accompany all this testimony. When you send your email to the legislators or to the committee, be sure you copy the legislative research. And now Sherry's going to spend some time sharing with you some of the real life examples.
Testimony that I used when I testified in Leavenworth. And as you can see, I addressed it to the committees. And in the first paragraph here, I identified the organizations that I'm part of, thanked them. In this section here, I identified some key attributes that I wanted the committee to be aware of or to remind them of. For example, the prisons, the military installation, and that the northern half of the county is much more diverse than the southern half of the county. And then this fourth bullet just talks about how some of the House districts go into other counties and or other congressional districts. And then I provided my recommendations. The first one was about keeping school districts as whole as possible. And I have the exhibits. I'm going to show you about them. So the exhibits supplement my statements. The second one had to do with how the bottom half of the 38th district went into Johnson County. And then third bullet had to do with our development corridors within the county, how there's growth there and that it would be helpful to keep that within the same district. And then the last one was more applicable to the congressional district and not splitting counties when those boundaries are drawn. And then I thanked them. But this here is one of the exhibits. And what I did is I got the initial House district map from my county website. And then I drew the school district boundaries and also made note where the penitentiary is, the development corridors. But I was trying to really illustrate how right here in this district, it's covered by 3 House districts. So that was one thing, and then there was overlap down here as well. The second exhibit here talks about how this House district is split by the river, and everything below it is Johnson County, above it is Leavenworth County. And then this was the picture to support the splitting of the counties when drawing the congressional district boundaries. So the second testimony that I'd like to highlight is from David Norland out in Salina. And he noticed that he specified he ran for the House District 71. And in his testimony, he talks about how it was really clear that when he ran that, you know, that district boundary also split the population based on employment, healthcare, and it is an indicator that that population is not likely to generate a candidate. he did not have a map, but he also highlighted that his friends in Wichita, their districts were drawn such that the most likely conservative or rural voters would probably outnumber the more urban and progressive set of voters. So next, I'd like to show you on the Kansas Legislative Research Department's website. If you go to the redistricting link, there are some tables and maps that help you show the population change. But down here, it gives you a little bit more information about submitting the testimony. And if you click down here, you're going to see that everyone's testimony is listed. So you have a lot of different examples to look at. And so when you submit your testimony, that is public record and it gets posted. So if we go back a little bit, all the new testimony that was not part of the redistricting tour is posted under these links. So you can see everything that's come in past August. So the next thing I'd like to show you is that how to find your legislator. And you can, this is the Kansas Legislature website, and you click on find your legislator. And if you know their name, you can put that there, you know, first and last name. If you don't know their name, you can search by your address, and it's taken you to a different site that's separate from the Kansas Legislature site. I'll try that again. So here, I'm going to put my address in and search. And you can see my state House rep is Tim Johnson and the state senator, Tom Holland. I can click on that link and it has his address, email address, and his phone number, mailing address. So that is how you find your own representatives. And if you go back to this website here, the main page for the Kansas Legislature, and you click on committees, and you can go down and you can see there's a redistricting committee on the Senate side and one on the House side. But you can click here and you can find all the members of that specific committee. And again, there's links, hot links to get their phone number and email address. So just to recap then on the next steps, we are identifying areas. I'm going to stop sharing here. In your community that are important to be kept together, you're engaging your community members, completing a community profile. And we didn't really talk a whole lot about mapping applications, but a couple of them are Dave's Redistricting app and District R. Your county should also have a GIS tool that can be very helpful, and they also have some canned maps ready, and most of the counties have maps available on their website that you can just print. We talked about the census.gov, and just using Google, you can pull up a lot of information. You want to get the information in writing, and we are here to help, and our contact information will be available later. We'll send it out to you, but you know, we want to be helpful, and it's very important to provide that written testimony by December 31st. So with that, I am going to turn it back to, we're going to do question and answers. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat. Any questions? Okay, I am going to turn it over to Martha to say a final few words.
All right, well, if no one has any questions that they want to share with these awesome panelists, they very, very well versed on this topic. So by all means, if there's anything and that you have and want to discuss or approach, again, their contact information will be in the follow-up email. We do want to thank you for attending tonight's presentation. And a follow-up email, as we said, will be sent providing links to the testimony template and with that contact information should you want help with your community profiling workshop or to create a map. Please, again, just as a reminder, oh, we do have a handout. Let's see. Sherry, you want to follow up with that?
Sure. Jeff, what's your question?
Well, there is a unofficial proposal that's been floated by our House representative to realign districts 40 and 41 economically and create one district with the lower income population and one district with the higher income population. And that would split Leavenworth and Lansing both in half. It seems to me that's creating the same kind of problems you've been discussing, should that proposal go through. Any suggestions, recommendations on addressing this?
You should do our communities of interest and explain why that is not why it is a good proposal or is not a good proposal.
Yeah,
Okay,
Jeff, I think that sounds, this is Mary. I think that sounds like a perfect opportunity for members of Lansing and Leavenworth to get together and talk about whether they think that would be a viable way to go about it. There may be strong feelings, there may not be strong feelings in the community, but the only way that probably is going to come to the fore is if a bunch of people get together and hash it out.
Thank you.
I have one more
There
thing,
are a
Mary.
couple, there's a question here from Linda, and she's asking us, what do we see as the biggest challenge? Linda, why don't you unmute and maybe you could expand a little bit on what you're thinking about there when you ask that question.
Hi, Mary. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think the biggest question that all of us might have is, how do you overcome entrenched politicians who see it as, the norm to gerrymander to such an extent that, folks have that political advantage? How do we make this a win-win when we see that split happening sometimes? So I think you guys have done a great job of showing us what the correct way to go about this is, but I guess I'm wondering, since you've been familiar with testifying in front of folks and, really trying to understand what's going to persuade them, is there especially one thing besides being respectful that's going to really help?
I'll take a first swing at that, and then maybe some others want to weigh in. I think, Linda, the question really comes down to, how do you ever persuade anybody sort of to do what in your mind is the right thing? And and I think where the league is on that question, both here in Kansas and across the nation, is that if there are enough voices advocating for the right thing, the probabilities of the right thing happening go up a great deal. And it goes a little bit maybe to Jeff's earlier question too. What that right thing is really in this context, because we're talking about representation, which is a fundamental part of our democracy and the way we operate, that right thing has to be hashed out at the grassroots. And while we've got a long, very, very long tradition in Kansas of the legislators drawing their own districts, clearly we've got examples around the country that doesn't have to be the case. And I think raising voices is perhaps the most important thing to do and the most compelling argument. Connie, Sherry, I'll shut up now.
Well, from my perspective, being factual, don't let the emotion get to you, dig in, take the opportunity to provide the detailed testimony. If we don't provide the detailed testimony, then, shame on us for not taking the opportunity. And I don't like to assume that the legislators know everything. Like you do have to spell it out, and there are legislators on there from different parts of the state, so all of them I'm sure don't know about the county that I'm from, but the more people that provide testimony, the greater the likelihood that citizens will be listened to. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is when the draft maps come out, we need to be boots on the ground looking at those maps and again providing feedback. So just providing the more detailed testimony now, there's going to be more work later. That's going to require us to dig in and analyze what's going on.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add to what Mary and Sherry have said is that remember that you're telling your story, and it's public record. So remember that when there are court challenges, that becomes part of the court challenge as well. So a lawyer can use your testimony and said, hey, please don't split my neighborhood. Please don't don't split these two counties because we really are part of one another. And yet they turned around and they did. So just remember that it's can go a long way.
The other thing that I've learned by actually utilizing the mapping programs and experimenting with them is that some communities are bigger than the threshold for an allotted Senate district or House district. So they will have to be split someplace, but the question is where to split them.
And what makes sense? What makes more sense? We know that Wyandotte and Johnson County will no longer be whole within the 3rd Congressional District. And we had a little bit of Miami County in there too. So what makes better sense when we're thinking about the 3rd Congressional District? Do we want to include, what areas do we want to include and why? And, we're talking with some folks from Wyandotte to really go through that. It's like, why do we want to include one community and not another? Why? It's the why. It's the why part.
We've got another question here from Barbara, who wants to know how we work with non-responsive representatives.
My question really pairs with Linda's, I think, when she was talking about the entrenched politicians and the fact that, and when you said that you can't assume that legislators know everything. Those two things go toward answering my question. Because it's sometimes like people get in office and they don't have to listen anymore, or it's set up so that they don't have a challenge to what's going on. So I found that very helpful, and the number of voices I think is also very important.
So does that get your answers, Barbara?
It gave me some things to think about. Absolutely.
Okay, good. We've got another question here from Catherine, and she's asking whether we have suggestions on how to pull in local leaders who may have specific areas they feel need to be kept together. Connie, you want to take a swing at that?
Sure, by all means, invite them. I can tell you that it's just important. If there's someone in your community that would have information, bring them in, get them involved. Any kind of organization that you're part of, any organization that your neighbors are part of, sure, bring them all in. The more voices that you have that say, hey, look, I got together with this organization and this organization and this organization, and we feel our community is this street to this street to this street to this street. These organizations serve our entire community by doing X, Y, and Z.
Sherry, have you had any experience with that?
Not exactly, but a part of me says schedule a session within your community, see who shows up. Right now it's hard to get people out, but then another part of me says, well, reach out individually to different people, get what you can, and go from there. There are different ways to get community input, and the key is ask others what they're, what are they thinking?
Yeah, and I've got to say, I think at least locally here in Topeka, because we have city council members who are elected from single member districts, and we have county commissioners elected from single member districts, engaging them in the dialogue is liable to be also very instructive. So yeah, I agree with what both Sherry and Connie said. Welcome all comers.
And it is tough talking to your legislators because they have something to protect, and that's their seat. So it is a little bit of a tricky conversation if they're part of it, because this needs to be nonpartisan in what is best for the community, not what's best for the legislator.
So we've got another question here that I think maybe goes to the heart of what we've been talking about this evening, and it's from Susan, and she's asking whether we think it's more effective to submit written testimony or present verbal testimony.
I say do both. Submit that written testimony and be prepared to testify.
The other thing is as of right now, we do not have any additional listening tours on the schedule. And we hope there will be some, but if time is ticking and you haven't submitted written testimony and you're waiting on the next redistricting tour, you might miss out. So my inclination is submit the written testimony now, and when the redistricting tour comes to town again, if it does, go in there and present whatever you submitted.
Or
And if
when,
you-
sorry, go ahead.
And I was gonna say, and if you have some new facts to add to what you submitted written, add those new facts in. But the other thing, and I think most of you know this, but the amount of time that each person had to speak during the listening tour varied depending on the location and how many people showed up. So if you have 5 minutes, or let's say 3 minutes, you prepared for 3 minutes and they cut you down to 1 minute, you need to be prepared on a dime to get right to the point and use your 1 minute. So that it's oral testimony is a little tricky because you really don't know how much time you're going to get.
Yeah, and I'd add to what Sherry said too, is that if the legislative session starts in January, chances are those hearings will be held in Topeka in front of the redistricting committee. So, and again, it just like Sherry said, you may have less than a minute or a minute, 1 to 2 minutes to present. So have your written testimony done. You can say, you can refer to your written testimony and your oral testimony.
Right, and everyone that did oral testimony at this last redistricting tour, guess what? That doesn't show up on the list of people that submitted testimony. You have to go back and watch the recording to know about it.
Yeah.
We have another question here that I think is pretty intriguing. How important is it to have held meetings with neighbors and others before creating maps and testimony?
I think it's very important. You want to get together with people, start talking over, hey, what are some places where we all hang out? Who's our major employer in this area? What kind of issues have we had? You can kind of start making those notes and then put together your map.
I agree. I think the what do we want to say? Maybe the credibility factor goes up quite a bit if you can point to the fact that you and your neighbors have worked together to come up with this community profile and to do it specifically for the purpose of contributing to the redistricting process. That means a lot. It raises the hassle factor in term, especially when it's difficult. People are a little bit reluctant to get together all in one place, but it sure pays off in terms of credibility.
That same credibility too is if you're a member of an organization and say you meet with 3 other organizations, put those 3 organizations in with your testimony. Say I met with someone from X organization, someone from Y organization, someone from Z organization. And if they're comfortable saying their name, put their name down. That lends credibility that you're really coming together as a community. And you're saying, hey, this is our community. This is why it's important.
We have another question here, and it echoes one a little bit earlier. Lynn wants to know, shouldn't city council members, county commissioners be involved in speaking out about this? to which I would say, oh, yes. And then in Topeka in particular, and any other place where there are, where those individuals are elected, those representatives are elected from single member districts, of course, they've got some skin in the game, because their districts also are liable to have become unbalanced over the last decade because of population growth and shifting, and will need to be redrawn also. But yes, their voices, one would think, would also be being heard. I think it was Sherry who referenced that perhaps elected officials don't always have the same perspective as the grassroots. But that doesn't mean that's not a perspective that has to be thrown in the bucket and stirred around to see what we come out with as a result.
Yeah, I'll just add that I know during the listening tour, there were a couple people from the Johnson County Commission that testified, that submitted testimony. And then there were a couple other, I believe from Roland Park, elected officials from Roland Park testified. So yeah, they're just as important too, because they do have impact, you know, the close ties that you might have with another community. That's important. You have close ties with another community and you want to stay together. Absolutely. Do you have any other questions?
Okay, we've got, I think when Martha made it sound like we were going to leave without answering questions, boy, it got them going. Okay.
There you go.
Pat has a question. Do we know what the Kansas legislature's priorities are for allowing splitting of areas, like keeping counties together whole as a general goal versus splitting a portion of a rural county and joining it with another rural county? What is their mindset? Well, Pat, that'd be the $10,000 question, wouldn't it? Good question, Pat, and a great opening for us to remind all of you that the redistricting committees have not yet adopted their guidelines and rules that they will use to sort of govern themselves as they draw districts. So even if you haven't met with your friends and neighbors and come up with a community profile and are ready to put your testimony together, you can always jot them a note and tell them they ought to be adopting those guidelines and rules, because they haven't done that yet. So to speak to what the rules will be or what the guidelines will be in regard to splitting cities and counties, for instance, as jurisdictions, we just flat don't know. We know what the tradition has been in Kansas, and that is usually to avoid splitting cities and counties in particular, to avoid splitting precincts, and traditionally those things have been articulated in the guidelines. But for this round, we're out here floating without an oar.
But where the splitting really comes in is trying to be proportional. So yeah, it's nice to start off, compact, but then you look at, well, if I keep this county together, I'm over or under. So what am I going to do about that? And that's where it really gets, tricky for the map makers.
Yeah, I think it's harder on the congressional level because they have to be so precise, and they do have a little bit more flexibility and leeway when drawing a state house or state senate district. So, but yeah, it gets tricky.
Okay, and it looks like we've got one last question, and it is from Catherine. And it's one of those, just the facts, ma'am, questions. So her question is, would you please review what sizes districts should be, those that are over, what are those numbers? So the ideal population for a House district in Kansas right now, based on the 2020 census, is 23,504. For the Senate districts, it's 73,447. Typically, the courts have given legislatures some wiggle room in terms of not needing to hit those ideal populations precisely. And that traditional wiggle room is about 5% over or under. So for House districts, that would provide a range of population from 22,329 to 24,679. And for Senate districts, a range of 69,775 to 77,119. For congressional districts, it's different to the extent that those populations have to be really under federal court determination. Those need to be the ideal district size, which I'm struggling to find.
I've got it, Mary.
734,470. I lost it on my piece of paper. So that 734,470 ideal population for a congressional district really needs to be hit pretty darn precisely. There's not much wiggle room there. So Miss Martha, I don't think we've got any other hands up. I don't think we have any other questions in the chat.
It was just the threat that I was going to take you all away, the access to you all away, and it just spurred them to action, and that's okay. That's okay. These women they've got a lot of knowledge on this subject, and we're so very fortunate to have them involved in this effort with the league. So thank you all again for attending tonight's program. Keep your eye open for our email that will be coming out your way. It's going to have links in it for the testimony template, and also you'll have contact information. So, you know, as you leave tonight and you start mulling all this over, you start having these conversations with your communities, your neighbors, your church groups, your friends, and you are like, I know they mentioned something about this. I just want to ask Mary. I just want to talk to Sherry. Their contact information is going to be in there so that you can reach back to them. Make sure, keep this date in mind, that December 31st, we need to have that testimony into, with the community details, have it submitted. So it can be taken into account. And then obviously keep your eyes open as the maps start to come out from our legislature. As Sherry said, we need to be prepared to act. This is not going to be a, oh, so now we can start to think about it kind of thing. This is no, we need to act. So, and obviously keep your eyes and ears open for future information from the League of Women Voters. This is obviously of utmost importance to us, and we'll be getting out more information as it's available. So thank you all again for attending, and have a good evening.